And welcome back to 303. We are in Senior English A, and we now turn to the fourth of our offerings on page 302 in your hymnals. We turn now to our fourth of the offerings for the King James Version of the Bible, and the text that is often referred to as the parable of the Prodigal Son. Now, I've mentioned in an earlier lecture, obviously, a number of things about this title, but now what we want to do is a line-by-line reading exegesis of the text. I think the easiest thing for us to do, though, is to begin with a reading of the text. Let's enjoy the language of the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, powerfully poetic, and let's begin with a definition, just so we know what we're talking about, to the word parable. So let's write that one down. Parable. We'll get to a definition of prodigal, as in prodigal son, in a bit. But let's make sure we understand what a parable is. Two things about it. One, let's write it down. We're working, by the way, at 2B, okay? A parable is always a story or a narrative. And then number two, this story or narrative can have multiple meanings and or interpretations. Okay? In other words, it's a story that's not just to entertain, but is supposed to teach us something important. All right? Now, we are reading from the King James 1611 translation of the Bible. We are working with the third gospel, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. Let's write this down. Chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. We mentioned in an earlier lecture that there are two different parts of the King James Version of the Bible, this Protestant translation. The first is what we call the Old Testament, and our first two readings from Psalm 23 and Psalm 137 come from the Old Testament. And now our second of two readings from the New Testament. We looked earlier at the Sermon on the Mount. Now we turn to the parable of the prodigal son. Okay? Our speaker here is Jesus Christ. Again, to remind you, the book of Luke is one of those four Gospels, the story of Christ. Okay? So here we go. We are now working with this story of the prodigal son. Again, we'll define prodigal in a little bit. Let's just read the story. And he, Jesus, said, again, I'm on page 302. Read with me. A certain man had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and he will say, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose, and he went to his father. And when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion, and ran, and fell on his neck, and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Top of page 304. And when the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. And they began to be merry. Now, his elder son was in the field. And as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants, and he asked what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. And he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out, and entreated him. And he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. And it was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead, and is alive again, and was lost, and is found. Okay, let's now turn to this text. Again, I want to go back to something I said earlier at level 2B. Let's write it down now. We can treat this as a religious text because, of course, it appears in a religious document, the Bible, the King James Version of the 1611 version of the Bible. Or we can treat this as a literary text. Earlier, we used this term apologetic versus non-apologetic study of text. An apologetic study of a text is to try to either prove its truth or its untruth. A non-apologetic study of a text is simply to look at it in some kind of objective way and then try and gain some meaning. We will look at this text then as a literary text, and we will use a non-apologetic approach. That will mean that there are obviously religious interpretations of this text that we're not going to spend much time with. However, we are going to talk a little bit about the implications of this text. Let's go ahead now and begin at level 1. We are simply summarizing what is ostensibly a 3-part story. All right? As I mentioned in another lecture, I'll summarize here very briefly again. What is that 3-part story? Part 1. Youngest son comes to father and says, I am ready for you to give me the money that is a part of my inheritance. Father gives the money to the kid. The kid goes to Vegas and he totally blows it on strippers and pole dancers. So much so that he finds himself unable to even afford anything to eat. And so he's living next to a dumpster behind some building, and he's eating the garbage that is thrown into the dumpster. In our story, even more disturbing, he ends up taking care of the most unclean of animals, pigs, swine, and he's having to eat their food. Yucky. He decides, you know what? This is no good. My dad is a millionaire. He's got lots and lots of money. He's got servants who actually get to eat better than I do. I'm going to go home, and I'm just simply going to ask him if he'll take me back, and maybe he'll just let me be a servant. That way I can at least get a meal. Part 2 of our story. He goes back home. Interestingly, for our notes at level 1, we will point out that father sees the boy coming. Why? The father's been waiting for the return of his son. That is to say, the lost son, the son to return. Now we can define it, the prodigal son. Okay, so now you know the definition of the term prodigal, right? He who once was lost but now is returned. The boy immediately uses his line to the father. Hey, I'm sorry, I've been an idiot. I went to Vegas and blew $10 million on strippers and pole dancers. Please forgive and let me be a servant. The father, part 2 of our story, the father is so excited about the return of the kid, he turns around and he throws this huge party for the kid. Welcomes him back as his own son. Part 3 of our story is, of course, going to be a subject of much discussion and debate. Part 3 of our story is what happens when the older brother, let's not forget that this is the older brother. The older brother comes in from the fields working. We infer from the story that the older brother is the one who's always been there, consistent, hardworking, doing his job. And when he comes towards the house, he hears all the partying. He's like, dude, what's up with the partying? And the servant says, dude, your bro, he went to Vegas and blew 10 mil on strippers and pole dancers, but now he's home and your dad is throwing him a big party for coming home. Part 3 of our story. Older brother is not pleased at all. Older brother says, whoa, are you kidding me? Very upset. In fact, he even chastises his father because he says, hey, 2 things. First off, I've always been a hard worker. Secondly, I've always been a hard worker. Dude, what is up with this? You're gonna actually throw a party because my younger brother went off to Vegas and blew 10 mil on strippers and pole dancers, comes back home, and you're gonna throw a party? This is unfair. To which the father's response in the third part of our story is, no, you don't understand. Your brother went away, and I was worried about him, like he might end up some heroin addict on the streets of Vegas. And he came home. I'm happy about that. I should be able to throw a party when my son comes back home. End of story. Now, because this is a parable, we have to obviously at level 2A begin to ask some really interesting questions about this story. Let's go ahead and jot down some of these questions at level 2A, and we'll begin to maybe analyze a little bit about what's going on with this story. Okay? First of all, let's ask what this is actually a story about. We can identify several, and before we go much further, I want to pay attention on page 302 to World Literature Connection Box. Do you see it on 302? Read it with me on page 302 really quickly. Parables around the world. The oral traditions of Zen Buddhists, Islamic Sufis, and Jewish Hasidism all use parables to teach ideas about morality, philosophy, and religion. A Sufi story tells of a man who is chased by a hungry tiger. Finally, the man turns around and cries to the tiger, "Why don't you leave me alone? Why don't you stop being so appetizing?" responds the tiger. This parable points out that there is always more than one way to see a situation. And then notice the connect to the literature. In what ways does the parable of the prodigal son challenge long-standing attitudes? Now, let's point out a couple of ways in which this story has clearly been working together for a very long time. One, what is this story about? One, well, we could say this is a story about a father and a son. Right? This is a story about a father and a son. The boy comes to the dad and says, "You know what? I've had enough of living with you. I've had enough of living in this provincial small town where there's only 3 stoplights. I want you to give me the money that will be part of my inheritance, and I'm going to go and do something with it." Off to Vegas he goes, blows all the money, and then comes back home. And his father has got to decide how he will treat a son who has left, blown all the money, and now is ready to come back home. This is a story about a father and a son. But wait a minute. It's a story about a father and a son. That is to say, the older son, who comes home from working in the fields. He's the disciplined one. He's the assiduous one. He's the trustworthy one. He's the one that's always done it the right way. And when he comes in, he cannot believe that his father is throwing a party that his younger bro came home. Right? He, in fact, lectures his father, and his father has to then say to his son, see, we're back to this father-son gig. You know, you don't understand what's going on. Number 2, this is a story about brothers and brothers. Now, of course, this is a very ancient story. And by the way, when Jesus Christ is telling this story in Luke 15, he knows that his audience is aware of famous motifs that fall along these lines. The most famous is obviously the Cain and Abel story of the book of Genesis, another book of the Bible, chapter 4. What happens in Cain versus Abel? An older brother gets mad at a younger brother, says, let's go for a walk in the Badlands, and only one of them comes back, right? Okay, Cain kills Abel. This idea of friction between brothers is an ancient motif. We see it a lot. And of course, in our story, we infer that older brother has some real problems with the way younger brother is going to blow all the money and then want to come home. Number 3, notice the ways this story is so rich in interpretations. We're working now at 2A. Number 3, this is a story about money. Yeah, think about it. This is a story about money. For example, this question. If you, as a parent, have a lot of money, is it a good idea or a bad idea to give your kids money? Should you give your kids money if you've got money? So for example, let's just imagine that you really do figure it out after you graduate from Moreland High, and you go on to make serious bank. Let's just say that by the time you have a 16-year-old son, you are worth $5 million. Whoa, fluid cash, that's what you got. And the kid comes up to you and says, hey, I just got my license. I'd like to have a vehicle. And the one I'd like to have is a really nice vehicle. Question, do you buy it for him? If you can buy it for him and it doesn't affect you economically at all as a parent, question, why wouldn't you buy that for your son? Answer by many of my seniors. I'm going to tell you why you don't buy it for your son. Because when you give your kids stuff, they do not respect its value. You have to make them work for whatever it is they get, or they won't respect money. This is a story about economics. Is it the right thing to give a kid, a young person, a lot of money and then watch them to see what they're going to do with it? Is that good parenting? Is that bad parenting in relationship to money? Number 4. I told you this is a story rich in implications at 2a. What about, this is a story about parenting. Whoa, now let's think about this for a moment. The boy goes off to Vegas and blows all the money. Whoa, $10 million on strippers and pole dancers. Has a great time. While he's doing it, obviously he has lots of pals. And then, of course, once he runs out of money, he runs out of pals. He's stuck somewhere behind a casino, living next to a dumpster. And then it occurs to him, you know what, this sucks, I'm going home. Question. Does the father parent well by allowing the son to come back home? What's the famous saying? Often parents are accused of saying this to their children who screwed it up. You made your bed, now you what? Right, you get to lie in it. But wait a minute, that's not what this story does at all. The kid goes off and blows all this money, and when he comes back home, the father seems to imply he's so excited that the kid is still alive. He didn't become a heroin addict and OD on the streets of Vegas. So the dad is ready to say, I don't care that you blew all that money. You're alive. I'm just so happy you're alive. I want to throw a big party. Another question. Does the father do the right thing parenting by throwing a party for the son? Or is he sending the wrong message here? Is he saying to the boy, you can go off and do all kinds of crazy and then come back home and I'll still accept you? Of course, you'll maybe remember in your junior year of study, Robert Frost's classic poem, Death of the Hired Man, at level 3A. We're making an observation here, right? Death of the Hired Man. Home is where when you go back, they have to take you in. Frost, of course, playing along with this story from Luke 15, right? The Prodigal Son. Of course, all of these questions can be answered in multiple ways for us, right? Let's jump really quickly, though, to 2b. Let's point out, this is an amazing parable that will play on multiple levels of interpretation. So let's put that in our notes, that this is a parable, a story with all kinds of meaning. Let's also point out that there's some interesting language, like we have pointed out before, in the 1611 translation of the Bible. So, for example, you have some interesting uses of words in different parts of our story as we are reading. Notice again, we have this notion of the TH being added on certain of the words to provide us with a certain kind of rhythm, right? Notice there are no quotation marks. Did you see this? Notice there are no quotation marks in the work of the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. Rather, sometimes a colon, and then whatever is to follow are words that are to be spoken, right? Finally, let's jump to level 3 really quickly. At 3A, what is for you your favorite movie about family? What is for you your favorite movie about the relationship between a father and a son or a daughter? What is your favorite TV show about family? What is your favorite song about family and the relationship between father and children? One of the interesting things, obviously, about a text like this is to ask all the stuff that's missing. For example, where is the mother in all of this? Notice, not in the story, right? Where are the daughters in our story? Notice, not in this, right? This is a story about a father and 2 sons, yes? What's your favorite movie about 2 brothers? Of course, we're going to have this as classic stuff. Let's write down the famous Steinbeck novel, East of Eden, the relationship between 2 brothers. You can think about any number of favorite movies where 2 brothers end up having to go at each other. 2 brothers who have to figure out somehow the conflict and resolve it, right? What for you is a story that's very similar in regards to the ways in which 2 brothers don't see eye to eye. And interestingly, is it about age? Is it true that very often older brothers have a hard time understanding younger brothers? Is this a story about favorites and playing favorites? Is this a story about a father who plays favorites with the younger brother and it makes the older brother mad? Let's jump to 3b. The questions obviously abound here. Since we're on it, let's ask it now, and you can jot it down and think about it yourself. Do you think that it's inevitable that a parent will play favorites with the different children in the family? Is that inevitable? Can you actually raise more than one child as a parent and not play favorites, not choose your favorite? Or can you, in fact, treat them all as equals? In this story, do you see that the father is treating the brothers as equals? What about your opinion of this story in terms of parenting? Do you think the father does the right thing? And now we'll ask a series of questions. You can jot down yes or no and then write at length about this. Do you think the father does the right thing by giving the money away to his boy early? When he's young, when he's irresponsible? Do you think the father already knows that he's going to go to Vegas and blow the 10 mil on pole dancers and strippers? Do you think he wants his boy to learn a lesson the hard way, and he's willing to drop 10 mil for the boy to learn it? Whoa, interesting question. Do you think the father is a good father by letting him back? If you were a dad and your boy came to you and said, give me the money, and you go, fine, take the money, and the boy runs off to Vegas and blows 10 mil and then comes back home, you're going to let him back in the house? Are you going to run down the driveway, give him a hug, kiss him on the cheek and say, I'm so glad you didn't turn into a heroin addict when you were blowing your 10 mil? Whoa. To what degree do you think this is good parenting? What about the brothers? Is there one of the two brothers with whom you more identify with? This is an interesting part of our story. Some seniors will read this story and go,